I love this. I love the fact that it's in a museum in the midst of living history. And I honor the fact that you all have come here early in the morning to hear me speak. I really appreciate that. And traveled. I asked some folks where they were from, and they came from different parts of the state. So I said, wow, this is amazing. So what I want to do is share my life with you and talk about, not much about what I do, but how I got here. So if you would indulge me for the next half hour or so. I'm from Norwalk, Connecticut, born and raised in Norwalk. And I want to start at the point of when I turned 13 years old. And I turned 13 years old in the hospital. I was diagnosed with spinal meningitis. And I recall very vividly laying in the hospital room. And I looked at my mother, who was over in the corner of the hospital room. And she was crying. And there was this big, tall man standing over me, praying for me. Tall white man in a white collar. And what I now know was he was giving me my last rites. And I looked at my mother and I asked her if I was going to die. And she just cried harder, which to me meant yes. Obviously, I didn't die. And when I got home, one thing, I was in the hospital for 2.5 weeks, and what I realized was my father had never come to see me. And I was wondering all this time where my father was. And when I got home, what I found out was he was in his room talking to himself. And this went on for the next year, that my father would stay in his room. He stopped going to work. He stopped getting dressed. He didn't come out the room. And as you passed by, you would hear him talking as if he were having a conversation with somebody. But there was no one in the room. And so by the time I was 14 years old, my mom, I had a younger brother and I have an older sister. We packed up and we left. And we moved to Stamford, Connecticut. My mom worked in Stamford. She worked at Pitney Bowes. And so we left this house that we were renting. I grew up in the projects and we moved from the projects and we was renting this house. And now we found ourselves in Stamford living in a 25 by 25 room. And my mom and my younger brother slept on a small bed. I slept on a recliner chair, and my sister slept on a little couch. And this is where we lived. We shared a bathroom and a kitchen with other people who lived on the same floor of that building. And I still didn't know where my father was or what happened to him. And I was an athlete at the time, and my coach got me a little job bagging groceries. Back then, you got a job bagging groceries, and I would make a little bit of money from tips. It was grade A market in Stamford, and I would save my money. And I would hop on the train, and I would take the 4:40 train back to Norwalk because that's where all my friends were. That was where my community was. And it would allow me to not have to go back and be in that room and sharing the bathroom and kitchen with folks who I realized were just getting out of being incarcerated. And so this one particular Wednesday, I got on a 4:40 train to go to my friend Tony's house, and I walked through the train. You know, you walk through the cars, pushing the door, and I pushed the door, and I saw this man, this African American man, sitting down He had a gray kind of checkered suit on. And he was sitting down with his legs crossed, and he had like yellowish blue socks on. And I was just struck by him. There was just something about him that made me stop and look. And I stood up in proximity to where he was sitting, and I just looked at everything this man wore. I looked at the newspaper he was reading. I listened to the way he sounded, the words he used while he was talking to his colleagues. And I projected onto him. He was an archetype for me. And I projected a life onto him that I didn't even know was true. And the very thing I said was, man, his son must be really happy to have a father like that. And so what I conspired to do was take the 4:40 train every Wednesday and look for this man. And that's what I did. Every Wednesday at 4:40, I would be at the Stanford train station, and I would get on that train, and I would walk that train and look for him. And he was always there. And I would set myself up, and I would make mental notes of everything this man did, how he folded his newspaper, what suit he wore on that particular day, and how many times he wore it in between those Wednesdays. The texture of his voice, how his hair sat. He had grayish temples, hair on his temples. And I did this for about 7 to 8 months, because I knew at 14 years old that I was in trouble. I knew that something about my life wasn't right. I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't think critically about it, but I knew that my existence was not normal. And I knew I would be in trouble soon. And so I needed something to really lean on and to somehow hopefully guide me through the life I was living. And so after that, I was in high school, and because we lived in deep poverty, and my mom tried the best she could do with all of us. We thankfully got out of living in that room after a year and a half. But consequently, because we were living in deep poverty, we could never pay our rent. My mom could never pay the rent, so we were always being evicted from where we lived. And when you had to, at those times, you had to go to school where there was no inter-district magnet and all that stuff, right? You went to school where you lived. And so consequently, because of that, I always had to go to a different school because I always lived somewhere differently. So I went to 4 different high schools, every year of high school. And, when I left high school, I was ill-prepared for college, but I got into college because there was a man who ran the Carver Community Center, Mr. Fuller, Mr. Richard Fuller, who went to the school that Veronica mentioned when introducing me. And he got me into that school, and that's where I met Veronica. But I didn't finish because I wasn't prepared for college. And so I came home, and I got odd jobs here and there, and I ended up working at the post office. In 1988, I was 22 years old at this time, with no skills. But I got a job that I thought was honorable and decent at the Stanford Post Office. And that was January 1988. I started that job. My brother, who was 4 years younger than me, was shot and killed in June of the same year. Shot and killed in front of me. And I worked that job still thinking about where my father was, not knowing anything. Even when my brother was shot and killed, I still hadn't encountered my father. Had no idea where he was, what happened to him, or why. And so I worked at the post office. I met a beautiful, she's still beautiful, woman, who is stunning. I remember asking her out, and I was like, I know she's not going to go out with me. And she said yes. I could not believe it. And she still makes me nervous. She's that just amazing, and I like her. I just don't love her. I really like my wife. And so I met her, and we got married, and we had children. And all this still while working in the post office. And although an honorable job, I started really thinking about what has my contribution been to my family. What have I done to make my family proud, especially my daughters, who our hope was and our dream was for them to go to college and live a better quality of life than I had. And so, after 12 years of working at the post office, still not knowing where my father was, having no idea what happened to him, because no one talked about it. All I knew is he just started talking to himself. That's all I knew. I decided to go to school. I decided to go back to school. And I've been telling my wife, I want to go to school, I want to go to school, because I was, and it sounds really pretentious, but it's not. It's not arrogant. I was smart. Like I knew things. And I knew I was very different. And so what I did was I made a pact with myself and with God that I would read a book every 2 weeks to compensate for the lack of formal training that I knew I didn't have. And so I decided to go back to school, and I had been talking about it a lot, and my wife at this point didn't even want to hear about it anymore. And what I did was I worked nights at the post office, and one particular morning I left work after work, and I went to Bridgeport, and we lived in Bridgeport at the time. And I parked on the side street of Housatonic Community College. And I parked, and I went to sleep. Because I knew when I woke up, I'd be in front of the school, and I would go in. Had I went home, I would have went to sleep, and I would have never went downtown to go to school, go and register. So I registered for college. I took a couple of classes that I liked, because I knew if I didn't like them, I wouldn't stay. And we ended up moving to New Haven. We found a house in Westville. And then I transferred to Southern Connecticut State University, and I decided to go to school full time. I changed my hours at work and worked from 6 in the morning to 2:30 in the afternoon. And I would go to work early in the morning. I would leave my house at 5 in the morning, which meant I got up at 4:15, got on the road, got to work in Stamford, worked, leave work at 2:30, get home hopefully around 10 after 3, pick my girls up who were at Davis Street School, and my oldest girl was at Betsy Ross School at the time. Take them to dance class or wherever they had to go, and then I would go to school. And I would be in school all evening, because I was full time, so I had 3 or 4 classes, usually 3. And I did that for 4 years. And I would write my papers through the night into the morning. I would do my homework while on my breaks at work. Excuse me. Because it was important to me not only to show my girls that it could be done, that education is continuous, but it was important to me to finish, because I don't think you can trust people who don't finish things. And so in 4 years I finished. My 3rd year, my dream was to I wanted to teach. And I wanted to teach especially black boys who were living in the conditions that I was able to overcome. That was my dream. And so my 3rd year of school, I had to do an internship. And my advisor, Dr. Shirley Jackson, who is no longer at Southern anymore, knew I wanted to teach, knew I wanted to work with kids, knew I wanted to work with families. And so she sent me to this place called LEAP. I never even heard of LEAP. I was from Norwalk, lived in Bridgeport, and my time in New Haven was basically to go to school and sleep. And so I did an internship at this place called the Leadership Education, Athletics, and Partnership in New Haven. Um, I would be in their offices Monday and Tuesday, because those were my days off from the post office. And I would do whatever it is they told me to do, whether put up bookshelves or go to Nika's or wherever, I'm naming places in New Haven, or Modern Pizza and pick up pizza for these young kids. I was the errand guy, whatever it is they asked me to do, and also work with families and the children at Dwight School and Conti School. Whatever they asked me to do, I did. Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I worked at those schools with those families. And I did that for a year. I wrote a thesis about LEAP. And in May, right after I graduated, actually in June, LEAP was having a fundraiser, a golf fundraiser. And they asked me if I wanted to come. And of course I did, because I loved my time there. This is a true story. And I called in sick at the post office, and I went to play golf. And I walked in the clubhouse, and I sat next to this guy. His name was Andy. His name is Andy Boone. I sat next to Andy. It was the only seat left. And he and I started talking. It just so happened that he was a board of director at LEAP. And he was there with his mother-in-law. And so he and I talked throughout lunch. And I told him my story. And I told him the things that I dream about doing. And he said, well, you know, is exactly what he said, we don't have any black people who are on the board of LEAP. And he said, your story and what you've been able to do is incredible. So I'm going to talk to them about you. A month later, I got a call from somebody on the LEAP board of directors to be on the board of directors of LEAP. I didn't even know what a board of director was. I swear to you, I had no idea. I was a postal worker for 16 years. I had no idea what it was, what they do. I just knew that I loved the organization that I was an intern in. And so here I am now on the board of directors for the very organization that I just the intern. And I quit my job and started pursuing my dream of impacting kids who look like me and their families. And was making no money. I was working in Meriden at the time at Thomas Edison Middle School, and worked there for 2 years. Went to grad ed, dreaming about being a teacher. So I was at Fairfield University School of Grad Ed while working at Thames, and got a call from Miss Veronica Marion, who was working at New Haven Job Corps, running all of their programs, and said she needed a teacher. And who wouldn't follow Veronica, right? So and it brought me closer to New Haven, and I started working for Veronica, still on the board of LEAP, loving what I was doing, working with kids, working with their families. And now from there, I came from a meeting. Veronica left me there. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And went to CERC. And I stayed, was still on the board of LEAP. We were looking for a new executive director. The board asked me to run the organization that I was on the board of and was once the intern. So now here I am, having no idea what I was doing. No idea how to run an organization. But I knew why. And I knew those kids because those kids were me. And I knew those families because the very symptoms those families are dealing with are the very symptoms that I was able to overcome. And so here I am now running this iconic, historic, youth-serving, child-serving organization in New Haven, not knowing how to do it, but knowing why I was doing it. And then I did well, because what I did was I created a LEAP that was reminiscent of the Carver Foundation that I grew up in. That's all I did. It's really logical. I did what I knew, and so I I did well, and I made a name for myself. Still not knowing where my father is, what happened. No one's still talking, but I am moving forward in life because I hoped and prayed that one day, if I ever were to encounter him, I wanted to be successful. I didn't want to be a bum. I didn't want to be someone who didn't do anything. I didn't want to be him or my projection of who he was. And so, again, I did well. This idea of the Connecticut Center for Arts and Technology came about and was really getting a lot of steam in New Haven. And Bill Strickland, who I believe is probably the preeminent social entrepreneur in this country, came to New Haven and to meet with me. He and a man named Carlton Highsmith, who is now my boss. And the only reason I took the meeting was because I wanted to meet Carlton Highsmith, who was an incredible, successful entrepreneur. And I was trying to raise money for LEAP. So I agreed to the meeting and to raise money for LEAP, quite frankly. And I met with these two men, and we sat for 3 hours, and we never talked about CONCAP. We never mentioned it. We talked about how we would save the world. What would we do individually to save the world? For 3 hours. And I walked away from that meeting thinking and believing that I could be them. Got a call a month later from Bill Strickland. Said he really liked me and was wondering if I was interested in building and running this new idea called the Connecticut Center for Arts and Technology. And I told him no. And it wasn't because I wasn't interested. I told him no, and this is the God's honest truth. Because I was scared to go to my wife and tell her I was leaving another job for an idea. Excuse me. So I told them no. And they did a national search. They came back to me 2 months later in 2011 and asked me again. And I got the courage to talk to my wife about it because I believed that I could impact more people if I was able to create the very thing that I dreamed about. And so June 2011, we started building the Connecticut Center for Arts and Technology. And it has been absolutely incredible what we've been able to do. Now, I'm going to go back because this is related to families specifically. In between where I am now and working at the post office, two things very profound happened in my life. This one particular thing is we went on vacation, me, my wife, my girls, and my wife's sister and her family. And we ended up in Clearwater, Florida. And I called my mom, said, hey, we're in Clearwater just in case you were wondering, we're going to be here for a week and a half. And my mom said, well, your dad has family in Clearwater. I said, oh, wow. And she said, I recall him having a sister named Edith in Clearwater, Florida. I said, okay. So my wife and I we looked in the phone book for an Edith or an E. Clemens. And then we couldn't find her, so we looked and called everybody with my same last name. And asked if they knew of me and, or my father. And all of them said no. And they were just so polite, so nice, but they would always invite you to their house and want to meet you. And I said, no. I wanted to see if my father lived here, or my aunt lived here, I'm sorry. And so this almost consumed our trip. So I, just said, we're not doing this anymore. So that Wednesday night, we went to dinner at this place called Krabby Bill's. downtown Clearwater. And it was so crowded, we sat outside, and my daughters were sitting on the bench together, and they halfway falling asleep. And every time, they were smaller, and every time you see four of the same gender, it's always, people want to talk to them. And so this woman came outside of the hotel and started talking to my daughters, and I'm watching her, and I'm watching to see how mannerable my daughters would be, because they were really tired. And so I said, excuse me. I said, we're here visiting from Connecticut. And I heard, my mom told me I have an aunt who may live here. Her name is Edith Clemens. And I wanted to know if you knew her. And she said, I don't know her. She said, because I'm not from here. My husband's from here, and he knows everybody. He's coming out now. He was paying for our meal. So her husband comes out, and I gave him the same story. I said, I'm from Connecticut. I heard I have an aunt named Edith here. I wanted to know if you knew her. And he said, she had a tall son, right? And I said, I don't know. I've never met her. He said, I know Edith. She has a tall boy. That's what he said. She has a tall boy, and she doesn't live far from here. He said, give me your number, and I'm going to take it to her house. So I wrote down my cell number and my hotel number, and I gave it to him. And I was like, man, please. He ain't. Anyway, because we struck out all week, right? And so we went in and had dinner, and my aunt called me 20 minutes later. And she works at the courthouse, downtown in Clearwater. She's a security guard in the courthouse. And so we talked for 10 minutes. And we made plans for us. We were going to Busch Gardens that next day, and we made plans to go and see her before we went to Busch Gardens. And so we made it to the courthouse, and my aunt was there, and she looks just like my kids. And the touching thing was she knew about me. I didn't know about her. She knew I existed. And so I told my aunt, I said, well, I got to take the girls to Busch Gardens. They were ready to go. And so we went to Busch Gardens. And we stayed the day there. And she said, I'll call you so you can come visit on your way back. And so she called me. And on the way back from Busch Gardens, it was pouring down rain. And I don't know if you've ever been there. There's this long bridge you have to go over. And I was scared to death because it was just raining so bad. And rain in Florida is different than rain here. And so we made it to her house, and she had conspired to get all my aunts and uncles and cousins to her house. And so when I got there, all these people were standing in the front lawn waiting for me and my family to arrive. And it had to be about 30 people. And there were aunts and uncles I had never even knew existed. I'd never heard of them. But they all knew I existed. And so I got out the car and met and hugged and cried with all these people and all this family that I didn't even know I had. And as we were all talking and crying, and I looked and I saw my father come from behind her house. And she had managed to get him to her house. And he came, and he was wondering what all the noise was going on in the front yard. And as he walked up, I recognized him immediately. After, I think I was 38 at the time, so after 24 or 25 years, here I am, face to face with him. And I had always kind of dreamed of this moment, and what I would do and what I would say and who I would be. And he looked at me, and he didn't even recognize me. And I got even more upset because he didn't recognize me, because he's messing up my moment, And I realized at this point, just looking at him, his life has been reduced to being homeless. And, he walks around town picking up bottles and cans. And has been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And so here he is standing in front of me, very feeble. And I turned to the side to look at my wife, and it was something about my profile that he recognized. And he grabbed me and picked me up and hugged me. And my father never hugged me, never. And I didn't reciprocate, I kind of stayed stiff because I wanted my stiffness, I wanted to be a message to him of how I felt. And my feeling was, how could you leave your family? And so he and I went into my Aunt Edith's house, and there's a back room in her house, and we sat down. And he looked at me, and he said, "Are you a teacher yet?" And I just looked at him. I said, "How'd you know?" He said, "I knew you would always be a teacher." And so when he said that, all that was in me, the very things that propelled me to be successful, I just let them go. Because I realized that the sum of my life is a direct consequence to the sum of his. And I was able to, in that moment, forgive him for leaving his family, but also I tried to forgive myself as I look at the condition of his life. And that was it. And we left there, and I had asked my aunt what happened. And she told me the story about him being taken from his father, when he was just born, was killed in a car accident. And his father's father, my great-grandfather, his grandfather, took him. Him and my grandmother and grandfather took him from his mother, who was still alive, and brought him to Connecticut, kidnapped him. And so he grew up thinking that his grandfather was his father, and his grandmother was his mother. And I grew up thinking that my great-grandparents were my grandparents. And he found out. He found out the truth. And when he found out the truth, the latent mental illness in him was triggered. And that's what happened. So we came back home, and about 7 months later, my wife and I were in the bank. We were in Fleet Bank in Westport. And my wife has Monday and Tuesdays off, and I had Mondays and Tuesdays off. And we were in the bank one afternoon, standing in line, and I looked, and I elbowed my wife, and I said, "There's a man on the train." And so here I am, 25 years later, the man that I saw on that train, who saved my life, was in the bank with me. Still had the same way about him. And I got out of line, and after he finished his business, I met him at the door. And I said, "I want to thank you. You don't know who I am." I said, "I was 14-year-old boy who was lost. And I saw you on the train one day. And I just want to thank you for the example and the model that you gave me at a time in my life where I was in trouble. I never asked him his name. He never asked me mine. I'm sitting here, I'm standing in front of a grown man now crying to this stranger in a bank. And he just said, "You're welcome." And what has happened for me, the blessing in all of this, is I have become the man on the train for the many children who are living in the same conditions that I was able to overcome, and the many families who every day are looking for answers to make it to the next day. So I've become, thank God, that person for them. And my success, and this is so important for me, my success is a consequence, not a reason. I never set out to be successful, ever. I never set out to make a lot of money. That was never my vision for my life. The vision I had for my life was to help the people who I knew needed help. But God would have it that I would be deemed successful as a consequence of trying to help people. It was never the reason. So that is my story. Thank you.